Hey guys, I have a quick update today on my 3DO engine, Matinicus. I have added wall collision and wall sliding, and I'll show that here in a second, but first I wanted to just give a high level of how it works. So it uses the same general idea that was applied in Doom. I didn't look at the Doom source code. I only learned about how they tackled this problem and then re-implemented it on my own. And it uses a block map. So concept. So if you look at this diagram here, you can imagine this grid that overlays the environment. And each of these elements in the grid would hold links to the line segments that cross it. So for example, if the player was up in this area here, this grid element would have the links to this line segment and this line segment. So you can run anywhere you want and only check the segments that are around the player. Now, the code right now is it's only checking single-sided line definitions, and that means a wall. It wouldn't check a two-sided line definition because those would be line definitions that just connect sectors together. They're not solid. So for example, if you look here in this grid, this lighter colored line and this lighter colored line, these are just segments that connect this sector to this one or this sector to this one. These aren't walls. These brighter colored lines, if you can see that, those are walls. So that's the difference between what's known as a single-sided and a two-sided. So quick recap, the player runs around the environment. The player is always in a given element in this grid. Go ahead and pull the single-sided line definitions that are in that grid element, and then check collisions with those line segments. So just to kind of seal the idea, you can think of the grid as a two-dimensional array, and then you have links to line segments, which are really just points A to B. So when I first implemented this, I had a rectangle, like a bounding box around the player, and that became very difficult because this environment isn't limited to just perpendicular walls. I can have angled walls, such as these. So I ended up changing the code to use a circle instead. So a circle with a radius, and that radius represents the bounding, the collider's bounding area. And so the idea is for each given line segment, I would get the closest point from that line segment to the player center. That would become a vector or a line that I check against the radius. So for example, here you can easily visualize that the circle is not touching the segment, but in code, I know that the distance between this point and the center of the circle is greater than the radius from this point to the radius. So there's no collision. However, here you can see there is overlap. The distance between the closest point on this segment to the circle is less than the radius, which means there is a collision. So at that moment, I create a unit vector that represents the repelling of that player or that object, that circle, pointing essentially away from the line segment. And I know how much to push the player back by. It's going to be the difference between the radius and the distance of this line here. So it would be basically this little sliver, if you can see my mouse, just by a little sliver here, the player would get pushed back by that difference, that overlap difference. So let's fire this up and have a quick look. The sliding, by the way, is a byproduct of this circle-like collision. So I didn't have to add any other logic to get that to work. So if I hit this wall here, I get pushed off. It even works with smaller walls like these pillars. You'll also notice that I have my velocity increases as I run around, and the player slows down as I stop. So I added some velocity and friction, which I think feels a lot better. It's less jarring, I think. Now, when you're moving around, I'm checking everything against a thrust vector. So the thrust vector represents where you're headed. So it doesn't matter if you're moving backwards. So the collision still stops. There we go. I'm sliding backwards against the wall. And it works even with diagonal lines. So if I hit this diagonal, it pushes me off. You'll notice that there's some shrinking of the texture map as I get close, if you can see that. That's just because as I clip that geometry to the camera, I'm not adjusting the preambles of the texture, so it's just fitting the texture on a smaller surface, basically. That's where that's coming from. But it works well even if I hit a corner directly. So yeah, the angle that the thrust vector is in relative to the line segment also controls the velocity a bit on your sliding. So for example, I'm almost perpendicular to this wall to my right. So you'll see how slow the player's sliding. But if I increase that angle, it speeds up. So that's very Doom-like behavior. And just one more quick note here. I also added some dynamic lighting. So I have this light table that I can adjust, which will increase or decrease areas of the map. And you could use that for something like gunshots. So it makes it a little more dynamic. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll keep you updated on more progress, and I will see you soon.